What's up, YouTube? So today I want to talk about creating lead lines. I want to show you a couple of my most up-to-date techniques for creating lead lines. And we have been working on this track from scratch, and it's about time to start working on like a main lead line. So yeah, let's dive in and have a look. So the first thing that I want to talk about is creating atonal FM, almost like robotic lead sounds. And we're going to do this in Serum. Firstly, I want to add a transpose because our kick and bass is in F. And so usually what I do is I just transpose everything to F so that I can play C and it comes out in the correct key. I've explained this so many times, I'm sure you're aware. Serum2 setup with a note transpose. And we're going to try to do everything within Serum here. Obviously, we've got access to a lot more effects in Serum 2 than we did in Serum 1. So we could pretty much get away with like all the distortions and everything that we need directly inside Serum. So you can use more complex waveforms for these kinds of things. I generally just like to start off with sine waves and then kind of morph them from there, because especially now with the new warp modes, like having this distortion sine fold directly here within the waveform, it just makes it much easier to create all sorts of diverse waveforms. And I feel like the result is a little bit more repeatable. So, you know, if we're drawing in waveforms, sometimes, you know, it's a little bit chaotic. Maybe you want that kind of effect. That's cool. Anyway, so what I want to do is I want to set up a basic sine wave here, a little bit of sine fold, and we're going to turn this level down. And then here we want to set either PD or FM from B. We can actually try them both. Usually FM, I find myself not using that much. Like about there or so. With a PD, I find myself going a lot higher. And so here we can actually turn the octaves down. And we're already getting a pretty cool FM kind of sound. Let's actually go ahead here and turn the octave down on the MIDI. And you see, just using these two knobs here, the sine fold and PD, like we can morph that waveform into quite a lot of different variations of that sound. Here we may or may not want to use this random, the phase random. Sometimes you hear every time I hit the note, it's exactly the same. Whereas with these randoms on, it's ever so slightly different. So kind of depending on the type of sound you want, you may or may not want to use those. I think for these kind of more static atonal sounds, we may just want to leave that random on because we may want a little bit of variation with the sound. Okay, let's move on to the effects. Here what I usually like to do is like a mix of chorus, some filter, and some distortion. So with the filter, let's go with a high 18, give it some resonance. Let's mix the chorus down a little bit. And then we can boost the distortion. Let's try one of these other, like the diode or something like that. Here we may actually want to switch this over to HPF. You see it kind of makes that tail only in the high end, whereas with low pass, the tail is a little bit kind of muddier. Here we can actually add a second distortion. You see, when we modulate this one, because of all the distortions and stuff, it gets a bit dirty. But we can always just add some kind of filter like after the rack and like use this as the sort of way of creating some movement in the sound. I find it's always cleaner to have this kind of sweepy filters and stuff after your effects chain. Well, not necessarily after the effects chain, but at least after the kind of like distortion, modulations, and that kind of thing. And then and then delays and reverbs tend to have after that sweep effect. Okay, let's go with the 1/8 dotted. And let's link the channels. Let's actually set up a macro here. Let's add a little bit of reverb. Cool, that's sounding awesome. So here we could potentially modulate this with like the mod wheel or draw in our own automation, or we could, for example, set up some kind of modulation source on the macro that's going to perhaps like do some kind of randomization. So note on random is pretty cool because then we can do like a random thing each time the note is triggered. Although this tends to not be as repeatable. So like if you find something that's cool, it's a bit harder to kind of render it out and repeat it over and over again, if that makes sense. So like this, for example, is kind of just every time it's random, you know? Let's actually go here into the envelope and maybe turn the sustain down. So it's a bit more kind of plucky. And the decay as well. So like with these things, sometimes it might be a good idea to actually just remove the delay and reverb and then just render out like a pass. Like let's say, for example, bounce this like this. And then mute, find the best parts. In fact, we can actually go like this and just press Alt and sweep the mouse along. And then let's say, for example, audition it and then just mute the ones we don't like. And then we can just add the delay. So another method we could use is instead of random, let's actually remove modulators. We could set it up to grab the velocity. And then here in Bitwig, we can actually generate random velocities. So we're essentially doing the same thing, but it's more deterministic. So we can kind of like repeat the results over and over again. So here, for example, all these velocities are the same, so it's just going to do the same thing over and over again. But over here in the inspectors panel, we can use this chaos, and what that's going to do is it's just going to generate random values across this range. So with these kinds of like heavily distorted sounds, it can be cool to create some kind of gate pattern. I guess we could potentially do this inside Serum, but I just find it a lot easier to use some kind of plugin like this because we can mix it in, mix it out, etc. So here I'm going to open Snap Heap. I'm going to add an LFO. We could also just do this with LFO tool, which is also Xfer, or the people who create Serum. But I really like this editor because we can pop it out and create patterns much easier. Let's go like this, and then like this, and then we can just move these like this. Oh, here we want to set this to sync. It just kind of gives it much more of a technical sound. Let's maybe put just a bit of EQ after this, just to remove some low end, which might be added to the transient because of the cutting. Okay, so then let's go back to this velocity. We can keep randomizing here until we like the progression that it creates. So I like doing this method for like more of the main lead kind of elements, as opposed to these more auxiliary leads like I showed just prior to this, because we can use the sweep of this macro to kind of change that randomization over time. So you're kind of randomizing a rhythm, it's repeating, and then you're modulating it slightly over time. Sometimes it can also be cool to go to this velocity and just change it so that it's not going all the way, so that you can sweep it and get it to go all the way, if that makes sense. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the more tonal and melodic examples. So I'm going to show you a couple of techniques that I usually use to write the notes, and then I'll go into just some basic sound design stuff. So with the notes here, what I'll usually do is, you know, if I'm kind of not feeling creative and I want to employ a kind of technique that's going to create better results as opposed to, you know, recording stuff in, then I'll usually go to one of either of these two options. The first is to think of more of a rhythm. So for example, let's do like da 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 da. You know, rather think of like the rhythm and then choose what notes to use. So let's actually just shorten this clip and then loop this just so I can make an example quick. So we've created like the rhythm, and now we can start to think what notes are going to suit this sort of progression, right? So we can move one up, move one, two down. What we could also do is we could start take what we've created here, lengthen it, and then create little sort of micro variations. So let's go like this. Let's duplicate. I actually kind of like that one up over here. Let's do one up. And then let's do sort of 3 loops and then a 4th one that changes slightly. So then this one can go down 2. Something like that, right? Super simple, but also pretty effective. You know, once we start to add modulation, a bit of sound design to that, you know, that could really work as a kind of main lead, right? And we didn't have to employ too much thinking. It was kind of just like, okay, going with some rhythmic numbers here, more than sort of music theory and that kind of thing. So the next technique is maybe a little bit more complex if you're not too familiar with music theory, but also it's kind of pretty simple still. So here what I'll usually do is select, okay, so I'll kind of break it down into trying to pick an amount of notes that's not 4, 8, 16, etc. Because I like to create these loops that are polymetric. So let's say, for example, let's create an arpeggiator using 6 notes. So it'll go 6, 12, 18, 24, and then it still won't loop then. Only at 60 it'll loop around again, I think. Is that even correct? No. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So you can actually choose where it loops around, but I'll get to that shortly. So let's say, for example, we want to choose 6 notes from the scale we're working in. So I will kind of just audition them on the keyboard. That kind of works, but maybe it's a bit too wide in terms of the amount of octaves we're using. We could maybe condense that a little bit. Whereabouts on the keyboard are we? We could maybe go... Yeah, that's pretty cool. 2, 3, 4, 5. I like the first few. Let's just put those in so long. Yeah, that works. That works. I wonder, that actually kind of sounds like similar to the MIDI from the beginning that we used. But anyway, here let's just audition it by shortening this, right? So now when we listen to this, it's not actually going to loop at the same amount of meters as the main beat, which is 4, 8, 16, etc. And what that's going to do is it's kind of make this short loop sound much longer. Okay, so with these kinds of things, we could just duplicate it over and over again, create slight variations. What I generally like to do with these is just to create like a bar like this, for example. So it'll kind of sound like it's not looping, and then it'll lock back into the loop, and then start to kind of break out of the loop, and then lock back in again. So it kind of creates a pretty cool groove like this. Or we can make it a little bit longer. What could maybe be cool here is to go down again. So with these kinds of things, I generally like to keep it kind of simple in terms of the wave shapes. We could just go with like a basic shapes saw wave, and we can add some unison here. Let's go with an uneven number. That way we have a nice solid center. Even just that, it was already sounding really, really cool. Let's add a filter here. Let's maybe go with a high pass again. So with this, I want to also do a thing where I'm turning down the sustain and decay, just so that that transient cuts through a little bit better. This more rhythmic progression here would actually work really, really well in kind of transition scenarios. So for example, here we could do like a lead in using this filter. That sounds really cool with the delay. We could kind of use that to create the transition as well by just like modulating the feedback up. We can maybe save this for like later on in the track. Cool. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. If you want to support me, the best way to do so is either heading over to my Patreon or checking out my store where I've got presets and samples and all sorts of stuff for sale. So yeah, check all that stuff out in the description. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.